Of course, we always start with a survey. And it's interesting, actually. There's some of the reactions. I remember at the book launch, we we had someone from a company that does employee engagement surveys, and they'd read the book, and their sort of reaction was that we as authors were against surveys in some kind of way. And of course, it's interesting because we're not, but we do critique surveys within the book. We point out shortcomings and advantages, but that's what we would do with all of the methods. So, to be absolutely clear, we do firmly believe that employee surveys are fundamental, and we would probably always start with some kind of survey. Absolutely. But just to rely on a survey only, which we did find talking to many people, there are a large number of organisations that do only rely on one annual survey to tick the listening box, and when of course that is really quite problematic. But to answer the question, there are I think we identified 16 different what we call methods of listening to employees in the book. So there are many, but to sort of just talk about the obvious ones, they are well, say that call them focus groups. I don't really like the term focus groups for listening to employees, but that's the language we tend to use that's understood. But essentially, is what I was talking about earlier: getting small groups of employees together with no real agenda set for the discussion, having leaders attend those, and just listen to what employees are thinking and feeling. So I personally am a strong advocate for having no agenda for those. And that's what I did when I was at BT. And I think it really surfaces some interesting stuff. But equally, you could go in and run a series of, call them focus groups, call them listening sessions on that basis with a specific topic, and that also is beneficial, of course. But there are a couple of things about that. I mean, for me, when I did this, I made sure that none of the employees who were invited were from the same team. So, and of course, make sure that none of the employees in these sessions are present, with a manager, their manager. So no managers of people present to be involved. And the reason for that is because if you attend a session like this with another employee in your same team, you may be conscious or worried about saying something that person who you work with may think is a bit silly or a bit strange. And the same goes for you would be reticent to say something in that setting if your manager was there because you might not be sure about how your manager may or may not take what you're saying. So that for me is the way I ran them. The senior leader that I brought in would just introduce themselves briefly for 5 minutes, and then under my direct gaze would not interact at all until everyone in the room had been able to go around and talk about things that they wanted to express. And then what I would do at that point was I would just collate. I would say, well, 3 or 4 of you have mentioned this topic. Let's talk about this. And then the senior leader's role is to sort of discuss that topic. But again, it requires quite strong coaching to the senior leader not to be defensive, not to go and answer it and say, oh, yeah, it's a good idea, but, we could do that, but we tried it before, it didn't work. That kind of defensive reaction has to be coached out. I mean, so the idea would be to say that, the leader would say, that's really interesting. Can you tell me a bit more about that? So you really delve into the topic without seeming as though you're cutting the conversation down, because employees are very, understandably very reticent often, even in these sort of safe scenarios, about saying something that they think might be taken the wrong way. So, and of course, the first time that the leader present responds, if they sort of appear dismissive, it completely kills the whole process, because after then, no one's really going to say anything. So it takes quite a lot of coaching to do that. But I love those sort of that method.
Mm.
So that I would certainly do alongside a survey and pulse surveys as well. So